Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Second system is wet sump lubrication system. So here the bottom part of the crankcase, which is also called lubricating oil sump, it contains this lubricating oil, and then from there it is being supplied to different components. Okay. Three types of systems are there: splash system, modified splash system, and full pressure system. I will explain them very briefly and very quickly. This is one of the most popular systems, particularly for cars, buses, and trucks. This is the system which is extremely wet sump system is very popular. So one is called splash lubrication system. So here you see this is the camshaft, this is the connecting rod. Okay, on the one this is the crankshaft, and this is the connecting rod, and here you have the piston. Okay. And obviously here, and here, two places here, and there will be another set of connecting rod and piston. Only one piston is shown here. Okay. So here you have the sump, bottom part of the crankcase, and here this will be filled with lubricating oil. So there will be a strainer. What is the function of the strainer? The lubricating oil, one of the important functions of the lubricating oil is to remove whatever debris are generated, where debris are generated or soot is generated. One of the important functions is to clean it up and deposit here. Okay. Now if you have debris here, you do not want them to be recirculated again, because once you recirculate them, then what will happen? They will come in between the interface of the mating surfaces, and if you have a small wear debris in between these two mating surfaces, what will happen? This will increase the wear, right? So this is extremely challenging. So you remove them, so only the clean oil goes, and this is the oil pump. It creates the pressure, and then there is a oil trough. Oil trough is where you basically it's like a small tank which is just below the crankshaft. And if you look at this connecting rod, below this connecting rod there is some kind of a geometry. It's like a finger. So when the crankshaft comes, this dips into the trough and throws the oil up. Where does it throw? On the liner walls, and that's how the lubrication happens. So oil level in the sump is so maintained that when the connecting rod big end, this is the big end, this is the small end of the connecting rod. Okay. When the connecting rod big end is at its lowest position, the dipper, this is called dipper, in the connecting rod end strikes the oil in the trough, which are supplied with oil in the form of sump with the oil. So this pump is supplying all these troughs. So these troughs are always full because they are being fed by pump, and so when this dipper comes, it is going to splash and it is going to lubricate the walls. But then once it splashes, the oil will be removed from the trough, and then it will be made up by the pump. Okay. So due to the striking of the dipper here, oil splashes over various engine parts such as crank pin bearings, piston skirt, rings, piston pins, etc., and the excess oil is supplied back to the sump. So it will lubricate everything, and whatever is excess, it drips back to the sump. Okay. So it's a very dynamic situation. So it's this type of system, splash lubrication system, is very popular for small engines. It's not popular for large engines. Okay. Splash lubrication system is not suitable if the bearing loads on the engine are very high. Okay. So that means for big engines it is not suitable, because these bearings 1, 2 and 3, it is not able to lubricate that effectively. Okay. So this is used, splash lubrication system is used for small engines. Then there is a modified splash lubrication system. So what modification is done is that instead of everything else remains same, here you see the pump is supplying the oil to this pipeline, and from here you have nozzles. So instead of splash, the nozzle is spraying the oil up, and then from here it will lubricate, it will splash everywhere. You can see this oil coming here because this jet. Okay. So when the bearing load is high, the modified splash lubrication systems are used. The main and crankshaft bearings are lubricated by oil under pressure, pumped by an oil pump. The other parts are lubricated by splash. So bearings are supplied directly by the oil pump. So bearings are lubricated directly, and the other parts are supplied by these 4 nozzles. Okay. Then the third system is full pressure lubrication system. Now what is this full pressure lubrication system? So in this, an oil pump is used to lubricate all parts of the engine. Here it is only the bearings, but here the oil pump is lubricating all the parts. Drilled passages are used to lubricate connecting rod bearings. So now you have drilled passages. So this drilled passage, there is the oil is coming here, from there is a drilled passage. This is lubricating the connecting rod big end bearing. Okay, from here there is another this thing, and then through the connecting rod there is a passage which is lubricating here. Okay, all these bearings are lubricated by passages. So basically in various components you have drilled very fine holes which carry high pressure oil under dynamic conditions to various parts. Okay, the cylinder wall, piston and piston rings are lubricated by spray thrown from the crankshaft and connecting rod. So in the crankshaft and connecting rod there are various holes which throw the spray up. Full lubrication system is used for engines which are exposed to high engine loads. So all the high performance engines which experience very high loads, which are expected to operate at high loads most of the time, they use full lubrication system. Okay, so most of the automotive engines actually use this kind of a system. Okay, so this is as far as the lubrication systems are concerned. Functions of the lubricating system. What does a lubricating oil system do? So it does few things. So one of the first work or first responsibility of the lubrication oil system is to lubricate. But lubricate is not the only duty that it has to perform. Lubricate is one of the main duties, but it is not the only duty. There are others. So lubrication, the main function of the lubricating system is to keep all the moving parts sliding freely past each other with low friction and reduce the engine friction and wear. Okay, so first function of the lubrication system is to lubricate effectively. The second function of the lubricating oil system is to clean. Because engine is having combustion, in the combustion process you generate a lot of soot and deposits and lacquers and all kinds of things which if you don't clean, they will build up, deposits will build up. So one of the important functions of the lubricating oil is to remove those deposits, because if deposits on any surface are undesirable, because if there is a surface which is used for heat exchange, for example, if you have deposits on it, what will happen? It will reduce the heat transfer, and then the device will not work effectively, right? If there is a deposit, if there is a mating surface and you have deposit on it, deposit will be soft and you have hard surface moving on it, and you must have heard this, that soft material always cuts the hard material. Ultimately all the hard material will also undergo wear. Okay, so deposit in any form is not desirable inside an engine. So to keep the bearings and piston rings clean of the products of wear and the products of combustion, especially the carbon, by washing them away and then not allowing them to agglomerate to form sludge. So one of the functions is to remove them. For example, you must have seen piston ring, right? Piston ring is, where is it located? In the groove, and there is not much of space in the groove. There is a mobility, you want that mobility in order to have dynamic seal. Okay, if the deposit takes place and that groove becomes smaller, then what will happen? Your piston ring will get stuck in the groove. It will lose its mobility, and if it loses its mobility, it will not be able to seal properly. So the bottom chamber will not be sealed against the top chamber. As a result, the blow by will increase. So then a lot of wrong things will start happening. So one of the important functions is that you remove the deposits wherever they are forming, but then one of the other important functions is that all those deposits, when they come to the crankcase, they should not agglomerate and form groups, because if they agglomerate and form groups, they will form clusters, and clusters are not good. So they should remain suspended in peptized form. The other function is sealing. Very important function is sealing. Lubricant oil must form a good seal between the piston ring and the cylinder wall. You must have seen here, this is a surface like this, piston ring also a surface like this. If you have to prevent the gas pressure from leaking here to here, this gap has to be filled. What fills this gas? This gap is filled by lubricating oil. So it seals, it prevents the leakage of pressure from the top chamber to the bottom chamber. This is one of the very important aspects of lubricating oil. So the oil should be able to form good seal between the piston rings and the cylinder wall. The oil should be physically capable of filling the minute leakage paths and surface irregularities of the mechanical sealing components such as cylinders, pistons and piston rings. Okay, the oil is used as a sealant, is subject to high temperatures. So wherever the oil is there, it is subject to very high temperatures. So it must possess adequate viscosity stability, even under high temperature conditions. Okay, now here comes another twist, because we know that any oil, when it is heated, the viscosity will come down. But what you are expecting, this function, if you want this function to be performed, the oil must protect the leakage even in high temperature conditions. Okay, so that means the oil must maintain its viscosity even at high temperature. Now this is counterproductive or counterintuitive, I should say. The oil which is supposed to lose its viscosity as a natural law with increase in temperature, now you are expecting it to maintain its viscosity even when the temperature is rising. So for that you have to add certain additives which will increase the viscosity with increase in temperature. Okay, so we will discuss it later. Believe it or not, it is used for cooling, and I think I gave you an example that in the high performance engines, piston becomes one of the weakest part which need to be cooled, and you cannot have water jackets, you cannot have air, right? The only fluid that you can use for cooling the piston is lubricating oil. Okay, so lubrication system is used to keep certain engine parts cool, which due to their physical location do not come in direct contact with the cooling water. So there is no way you can take cooling water to the piston. Okay, one such typical example is oil cooling of the piston of high specific output engines. So if you have a piston like this, okay, suppose this is the piston. So what you do in the this is suppose my cylinder block, and on this cylinder block I have, through some mechanism, there is an oil gallery, and from that oil gallery high pressure oil is coming, and I have put such a nozzle. Okay, so this nozzle, what it is going to do, it is going to spray the oil all over the piston to the internal surface, cool it, so all that heat that is being convected from the gases to the piston and conducted by the piston will again be convected back to the lubricating oil. Okay, and then of course this lubricating oil will go to an oil cooler where it will be finally thrown into water, it will be transferred to the cooling water. So the lubricating oil should possess good oxidation stability as it is exposed to continuous heating and agitation while performing its cooling function. And another function is to reduction in the noise. Lubricating oil should also reduce the noise a little bit. Now, so these are some of the very, very demanding expectations from the lubricating oil. So let us try and understand what is a lubricating oil, how do we make it. So you remember during the refining of the petroleum products, we discussed that there is a fractional distillation column, and first there are a lot of things come out, and then petrol, diesel, and then finally there is a lubricating oil that comes out. So lubricating oil basically contains two things, one is the base stock and the other one is additives, and you mix them and then it becomes lubricating oil. Base stock is what is coming out of the refining process. Okay. Now base stock is typically 70-80%, sometimes 90-95% of the lubricating oil, and 5% to 20-30% depending on what is their application could be additives. So base stock is basically the main bulk of the material that acts as a lubricant. Now base stock does not have all the properties that you expect from a lubricating oil. We have listed a whole lot of expectations, right? It should be able to clean the surfaces, it should keep them peptized, keep all the deposits peptized. You should be able to have good cooling efficiency. So all those things, it should be stable for a very long time. You should not be able to, you should not be required to change it for a certain number of kilometers. It should be able to resist the oxidation. It should maintain its viscosity. So there are a lot of expectations which may not be present in the base oil, because base oil is nothing but just a simple hydrocarbon. So what you do in order to have those properties, you put certain chemical additives into it and develop those properties, and that's how you make the lubricating oil. Now this lubricating oil is hundreds of different types. If you look at lubricating oil for diesel engines, it will be different. For gasoline engines, it will be different. For your manufacturing machines, it will be different. For your gas turbines, it will be different. For steam turbines, it will be different. If you want to do machining, you must have seen there is a white fluid that is put. That is also a lubricant. So depending on the application, you want a certain type of properties. That's where you take a base stock of the desired properties and put certain other types of additives into it to have your desired properties for that particular application. So choosing the right base oil and additives can be determined by application, and it varies from application to application. Base oils are produced by refining of the crude oil. Crude oil can be mineral type, crude oil could be plant or animal based or synthetic based. Refining process, when you obtain the desired viscosity, flash point and pour point of your base stock. You remove the undesirable products such as waxes and aromatics, you improve the color, and you stabilize. Stabilizers means, if there are any double bonds present or triple bonds present, then the oil will be unstable, because double and triple bonds means there is an appetite for hydrogen. Those bonds will break quickly and join with another hydrocarbon which is also having appetite, form larger molecules, and when you have larger molecules, you will change your properties, your viscosity will increase. Okay, so you stabilize them by removing the unsaturation. Now if you look at the other properties, viscosity, as I said, is one of the most important property. Viscosity of an oil is measure of its resistance to flow, and it is usually measured in terms of, there are many units, but this is Sebold Universal Seconds, SUS, which is the time required in seconds for a given quantity of oil to flow through a capillary tube under a specified condition. So there is a capillary tube, and you take a certain quantity, it flows from a certain quantity, whatever time it takes from flowing through that capillary, that will be used for calculating the Sebold Universal Second. Viscosity is normally expressed as at two temperatures, minus 18 degrees C and 99 degrees C. Generally for fuel purposes, we say 40 degree and 100 degree is what is more accepted, but then you can choose your own temperature and compare. Okay. Viscosity is also expressed as centi-Stokes, centipoise, redwood second. So there are, as I said, there are many scales depending on the type of apparatus you have and the procedure that you are following for the determination of the viscosity. Centi-Stokes is a unit of kinematic viscosity, while centifois is for absolute viscosity as determined by cold cranking simulator. Anyway, that is not very important. What is important is that you see here the temperature, here you have the colder side, here you have the hotter side. This is the viscosity, this is thinner oil, low viscosity oil, this is the high viscosity oil. So what you see here, that generally when you are cold, the viscosity is high, and as you are increasing the temperature, the viscosity falls down. Okay? But this is called non-VI improved. VI is viscosity index. Viscosity index is a parameter. Viscosity index is a parameter which I would like to define at this stage. Viscosity index is the resistance to change in viscosity with increase in temperature. That means if you are increasing the temperature and the viscosity does not change by a greater degree, that means you have a higher VI. And if you change the temperature and the viscosity changes quite by a higher degree, that means it is a low VI fluid. Okay. And how you do it? You basically put some chemicals, additives into the oil which are called viscosity index improvers. And just to put it simply, these are molecules which are temperature sensitive. So that means their physical size, when you heat them, their physical size, the dimension increases. Imagine a spring which is closed, okay, and when you heat it, it expands. So expands means the viscosity will increase, right. So you have base oil where the viscosity is going down, and you have additive added to it which increases its viscosity. So the overall effect of increase in temperature will now be lower reduction in viscosity. So if you don't put anything, then this is the line, and if you have put VI, viscosity index improver, so there the viscosity will not reduce by a great degree. So this is the VI improved. Okay. Now here you see this is increased pumpability. So that means if you are doing the viscosity index, if you are putting viscosity index, here the pumping losses will reduce because initially your viscosity has come down, and here the wear protection will be more by putting the viscosity index improver. So both in low temperature range and high temperature range, by putting viscosity index improvers you will get benefited. Okay. So viscosity index, the viscosity of an oil is substantially affected by its temperature. Higher the temperature, lower will be the viscosity. The variation in viscosity of an oil will change in temperature. It is measured by the viscosity index. A high viscosity index number indicates relatively smaller changes in viscosity when the temperature goes up, and vice versa. To improve the viscosity index of an oil, certain compounds which are called VI improver or viscosity index improver, they are added to the base stock. Okay. So this is all about the viscosity index. A cloud point and pour point. What is cloud point? Cloud point temperature, it refers to temperature below which the wax in the oil, this should be lubricating oil, form a cloudy appearance. Okay. So that means, you know, lubricating oil is a mixture of several hydrocarbons. So when you start reducing the temperature at certain point, some of those heavier hydrocarbons will start crystallizing, and they will start forming wax. This is that temperature, that is called cloud point. When the clouding of the fluid changes from crystal clear to cloudy, that's when the wax formation takes place. The presence of semi-solidified waxes thicken the oil and clogs the fuel filter, and well, this is not applicable, injectors in the engine, this is for diesel. So basically it is going to thicken the oil. Okay. Why it is important? It is important, for example, if you are taking your vehicle to say Ladakh, okay, and you want to start your car, and most of the lubricating oil has waxed, what will happen? If the vehicle starts, you will have failure of the engine because the lubricating oil is not present, and there is nothing to heat the lubricating oil sump as well. So you will have starved condition of the cylinder liner interface, piston seizure will take place. Okay, so that's why it is important for the lubricating oil. Pour point of a liquid is the temperature at which it becomes semi-solid and loses its flow properties. So if I have lubricating oil here and it is at a pour point temperature, if I open the cap and put it like this, nothing will come out. That's the pour point temperature. So these two properties are basically the properties on the colder side when you reduce the temperature. So under cold climate condition, they become extremely important for the performance of the oil. Flash point, this is a high temperature property. Flash point, the temperature at which the vapors of an oil flash when subjected to naked flame, this is known as flash point of the oil. Okay, so that means you have the oil here, you start heating it, at a certain point, if you show a flame, it will catch fire once. Okay, so that's the flash point. If the container is closed at the time of the test, this is called closed flash point. If it is open, this is called open flash point. These are just different ways of measuring the flash point temperature. Fire point, so flash point is you just show the flame and it will just flash once and then get extinguished. If it has continuous flames, then that's called fire point because it has caught fire then. So that's the difference. The fire point is the temperature at which the oil, if once lit by flames, will burn steadily for at least 5 seconds. Okay. So this is actually usually about 11 degrees higher than the open flash point and varies from 190 to 290 degrees centigrade for lubricating oils that are used in IC engines. So that means under no conditions your oil should reach this temperature because if that happens, the whole engine will get inflamed. Okay. So fire and flash points are good indication of relative flammability of the lubricating oil. And except for safety from hazard, they do not have any other significance for engine operation. So fire and flash points are more safety parameters and cold and cloud points are more from the cold climate working condition point of view. They are important. Specific gravity of the oil varies from 0.85 to 96. Okay, this is not very important except indicator of weight and volume. So this is not really very important. Carbon residue. This is the quantity of known mass sample of the oil which on evaporation under specific condition remains carbonaceous. So you burn a certain quantity and whatever is left as a cake, that's the carbon residue. Oiliness, this is a property of the oil to cling on the metal surface. So in the winter time, what do? You take oil, rub on your skin and then how good is the oil you figure out by how smooth your skin becomes, right? That's the oiliness of the oil. If the oiliness of the oil is good, it will stick to your skin and provide smoothness. Same is applicable to the engine also. The property of the oil to cling on the metal surface by molecular action and then to provide very thin layer of lubricating under boundary lubrication condition, and this is called oiliness or lubricity or film strength. Okay, so this should form very thin layer and reduce the friction. Oxidation stability is also important. What is oxidation stability? Resistance to oxidation. Okay. Why it is important? So due to oxidation, oil will form deposits on the piston ring and loses its lubrication properties. So you should always have good oxidation stability. The products of oxidation include carbon, lacquer, sludge, organic acid, which can be corrosive to certain metals. You must have seen that whenever you open the engine, there is always a yellow kind of layer present on all the components that are exposed to lubricating oil. That is because of the oxidation of the lubricating oil. Cleanliness, the absence of water and sediments are essential requirements of an oil. Water is not a lubricating fluid, it promotes corrosion, while dirt and small foreign particles of insoluble matter can cause great wear of the engine part and you don't want to have them. Color has no practical significance except how good or how bad the oil is. If the color is dark, that means a lot of soot has gone in. If the color is light, that means it's still good, it doesn't have soot loading. Acidity and neutralization number, the oil must be basic, it should have low acidity. If it is exposed to more combustion gases are mostly acidic in nature. So it should be basic in nature in order to protect the components. If it becomes more acidic, the components will wear out faster. The neutralization number is a measure of acid or alkaline contents of the oil. New oil has low neutralization number and used oil has high neutralization number. Okay. So the lubricating oil are classified as per SAE. You must have seen SAE 10W40, 20W40. So this is just the classification of the oil. So this is a method of assigning number of different oils in universal use. So 10W40 oil in India and 10W40 oil in US, they will have similar properties. They may be from different companies, but they have to meet a certain property table. SAE number assigned a number of the oil whose viscosity at a given temperature falls in a certain range. There are two temperatures which are used as reference, -18 and 99 degrees C, 5W, 10W, 20W. These three numbers are defined for viscosity at -18. -18 means they will be good at low temperatures, okay. And these are the oil which render starting in cold climatic conditions. So 5W, 10W and 20W are basically cold climate suitable lubricating oil. And if it is SAE 20, 30, 40, 50 grades, there the viscosity is measured at 99 degrees. So they are not for climate condition, they are for normally for normal conditions or hot conditions, hot environmental conditions. So whenever you see oil with a certain grade, you should be able to tell whether it is for cold climate conditions or normal conditions or for hot conditions. These numbers are merely used for classification of oil according to viscosity and do not indicate the quality of oil, since they do not consider factors like stability, oiliness, etc. Okay, I think I will stop here and I will continue in the next class. Only there, okay, I can finish it also, 3 slides only. So let me quickly finish it, okay. Additives. Simple mineral oil has most of the characteristics needed for a good lubricant. However, under varying operating conditions, they require certain specific requirements which cannot be met by the base oil. For example, you want to have good viscosity over a wide range of temperature, you want high viscosity index, you want resistance to oil oxidation, property to dissolve and clean the deposit, detergency properties, corrosion resistance. So all these properties do not exist in the base oil and they have to be given. So how they are given? They are given by additives that are added to it. And then water, resins and soot from burnt and unburnt fuel, which depends on the mechanical condition of the operation and load, greatly affect the lubricating oil. When they get into the lubricating oil, they will deteriorate the properties of the lubricating oil. So you want to put some additives which can fight these as well, okay, when they are used. So in order to confer upon the oil all or some of the above attributes, different types of compounds are added which are called additives. These compounds may give one or more characteristics, or different compounds can be used to give distinct properties, such as viscosity index improvers, antioxidants, detergents, dispersant. These are some of the names of the additives that are added to the lubricating oil base stock in order to give them desired properties. For example, if you add VI improver, the name suggests that this will increase the viscosity index. Antioxidant, that means it will help resist the oxidation attack, oxygen attack. Or detergent means it will keep the surfaces clean. Dispersant means it will not allow the deposits to get agglomerated, it will keep them in peptide form. Okay. So this table basically lists all the additives. For example, detergent, they control, they are used for control of high temperature deposits. If over base, they can act as effective acid neutralizer. So that means if acids are formed, they can also fight the acids. Dispersant, this is used for control of low temperature sludge and varnish deposits. Anti-wear, of course, is for reducing wear and gelling and seizure. Anti-rust is obviously for reducing the rust of different components, and they do it by forming the protective layer. Okay. Viscosity index improver obviously is to reduce the sensitivity of the oil viscosity to the temperature, should maintain its viscosity even when the temperature is rising. Pour point depressant, this is used for reducing the wax crystallization. Anti-foam agents, anti-foam is very important. If something foams, that means what? It means that all those bubbles will have lot of oxygen. So all the fluid is now exposed to more oxygen. So oxidation will become more. So anti-foam agent is nothing but a chemical which reduces the surface tension. So even if there is oxygen trapped, it will not form bubble. Bubble will be captured because the surface tension is less. Okay. Similarly, antioxidant, it reduces the oil oxidation, protects alloys and bearings against the corrosive attack. Oil contamination and sludge formation, if you keep on using the lubricating oil, they will become unstable for further use because there will be a lot of oil and sludge in it. Contamination of the lubricating oil occurs because of the oxidation, because of the dilution of the lubricating oil by fuel, by water vapor, formation of carbon, lead compounds, lead based compounds, metals, different wear metals may get added to it, atmospheric dust and dirt can enter into the system. All these contaminants when mixed with oil, they contribute to formation of sludge in an engine. Now this sludge, is black, brown and gray, it can be of any color. So if you look at the sludge, if you just take the fresh sludge versus if you remove the oil and then if you look at the composition. So the fresh sludge as it coming out from the engine, 80% is oil, 6% is water. But when you remove the oil, 40% is water. Gasoline is about 4.7% here. If you remove the oil, this will be about 27%. Free carbon will be there, about 10% free carbon will be there. Oxidized material will be about 5%, and then there will be free mineral matter, such as different wear debris, etc. So this is a very complex subject, and again, this is one area which is still active, and lot of research is going on related to engine tribology and development of different types of high performance lubricating oil. And I told you that nowadays the automotive industry is undergoing transformation. We expect a lot of power to be produced by a small size engine. So that means thermal loading of the engine is increasing. So more and more every component is exposed to higher and higher temperature. In those conditions, maintaining good lubrication becomes extremely challenging. Okay, so first of all, let us understand why do we require to test an engine. So obviously we require to test an engine so that we can have a device which is optimally designed, it performs optimally, it meets all the emission regulations, and its cost is still manageable. So to reduce the cost, okay. And one of the other objectives is to improve the performance. You want to extract more and more power from the smaller and smaller engine. So how do you know how much power you are able to extract? That you can figure out only by testing the engine. And obviously when you test the engine, you also want that it should not produce power just once, but it should keep on doing so for a fairly long period of life. Okay, so durability also needs to be tested. So there are many types of testings. For example, you might test the engine for performance, and that's a very small test. You might like to test the engine for emissions, that also is not a very long test. But when you are testing an engine for durability, obviously then you have to do accelerated test for a prolonged period of time to see which components start failing first. Okay, so there are different types of testings and they have different requirements, okay, and different time frames. Development engineer has to perform variety of tests. For example, one of the foremost important test is everybody is interested in figuring out what is the specific fuel consumption, what is the air consumption. So one of the basic tests on the engine is fuel and airflow measurement that we'll be discussing. Then taking complicated needle lift diagrams. So when the injector opens, closes, what should be the duration, okay, what should be the rate of fuel injection in the combustion chamber. The designer is also interested in taking into account the swirl effects. We have seen that in an engine, the fuel air mixes and the air could have different types of motions inside the combustion chamber, because the air motion is largely responsible for interaction of the fuel with the air, and in that way it affects the power output as well as it affects the emissions that are generated from the engine. So that way you are also interested in looking at what is swirl, and that require use of some optical technology, which could be endoscopic technology or which could be complete optical engine where you can see the entire combustion chambers. And then this is the frontier of combustion research, where you are interested in taking pictures of the fast burning images or flames inside the combustion chamber, because you are interested in figuring out which are the locations where soot is forming, which are the locations where air is not being utilized, which are the locations where your fuel is not penetrating and you are not able to optimally utilize the air inside the combustion chamber. So ultimately, whatever is happening in the engine, these two are more on a metal engine where you just guess things, okay, and the last two are more on the optical side where you are actually interested in visual evidence. Okay, so for most of the development that is done in the industry is done on these first two points, and then if you look at very detailed study of what is happening inside the combustion chamber, this is done using optical engines. Now, what are the nature and type of the test that you need to conduct? It depends on many parameters. For example, what is the degree of a development of a particular design that you are going to put in your engine? Okay, whether it is a rough design or just preliminary design, or you're just testing the idea, or you're testing the final product. And what is the accuracy that you require? For example, if you are having an engine test bed in a R&D center, so there you require extremely high accuracy. But if you have a engine setup at the end of assembly line where you have to just pass or fail the engine, there you don't need that kind of high accuracy. Okay, so depending on what is the accuracy required and where it is going to be used, the accuracy required will be decided. And obviously, as you try to put in more and more accurate experimental facilities or infrastructure, it becomes more and more money intensive and expensive as well. Okay, and then obviously everything is governed by how much money is available, how much funds are required. Okay, and what is the nature of the manufacturing company, whether you are interested in, for example, making a genset engine, which is not really very sophisticated engine, or you are making a engine for very high end comfortable car, for example, Mercedes-Benz or Jaguar Land Rover. So what is the nature? That also depends on what kind of testing you will be doing and what is your design strategy. So in order to validate this, many tests are required to be done. So the objective of testing of any engine is to understand the performance parameters in evaluation of IC engine performance, to evaluate the exhaust emissions and smoke that is coming out of the engine, particulates that are coming out of the engine. This of late has become, in last decade or so, this has become a showstopper. Okay, if you are not able to comply to emission regulations, you will not be able to sell your engine or vehicle. So now most of the development today is to control the emissions, whether it is gaseous emissions or particulate emissions, and now even the particulate number counting has come into the picture. So this is becoming more and more driver for development of newer and newer technology, and therefore newer and newer types of testing protocols are being also developed. And then if you want to differentiate between the performance of SI and CI engines, you need to do some tests. You calculate different parameters such as speed of IC engine, fuel consumption, air consumption, and a whole lot of other things. This is not a very comprehensive list of objectives. So in this course, since this is a preliminary first level course on IC engine, the testing is rather limited. So I'll be introducing you only to the basic testing protocols, and advanced testing such as optical diagnostics, etc. If you want to understand, you have to take a advanced level course. Okay, so right now my focus will be to only look at basic testing. So obviously, if we list the parameters that we want to test in the engine as basic testing parameters, this is not really a very comprehensive list, but most of the parameters are there. For example, you are interested in understanding what is the speed of the engine. Okay, you should know accurately at what speed your engine is operating. You should know what is the fuel consumption rate per hour, how much fuel is being consumed, or per minute how much fuel is being consumed. You should also be interested in finding out what is the air consumption. Okay, and you may ask me, sir, air is free, fuel is not. Why you want to measure air consumption? So the answer to that question is that for calculation of most of the parameters, you need to know air to fuel ratio. Okay, and in order to know the air to fuel ratio, which is an extremely important parameter that affects the performance, emission, combustion, everything in the engine, you need to know what is the air consumption rate. Okay. So, therefore, you need to measure what is the air flow rate or air consumption rate of an engine, and obviously you have to then measure smoke opacity, you have to measure different exhaust gas emissions. When you say exhaust gas emissions, mainly you are talking about gaseous emissions such as carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, hydrocarbons, NOx. Okay. These are the 4 regulated gases that you are, actually CO2 is not regulated. So, 3 regulated gases plus 1 particulate matter. So, these are the 4 regulated emissions that you are interested in measuring, and smoke opacity is one parameter which gives you qualitative estimate, not quantitative, qualitative estimate of the particulate matter that is present in the exhaust, and it is a very simple test. Therefore, it is in most preliminary studies, smoke opacity or smoke density, whatever you may like to call it, it is actually measured. Okay. And then obviously, you have to measure, what is the power being produced by the engine, because ultimately you are doing all this to generate some power. So, you should know how much power is being generated. Okay. So, but when we discuss the power, we know that there are 3 types of power measurement. First is the indicator power measurement, which is where the gases are transferring power to the first interface of the mechanical linkage, that is the piston. Okay. And then from there, when it goes to shaft, whatever is available at the shaft, that is called brake horsepower, and what is lost in between during the mechanical linkage is called frictional horsepower. And you are interested in measuring all 3 of them. Okay. Because ultimately you are interested in reducing frictional horsepower as much as you can, you are interested in increasing the BHP, and therefore you are interested in increasing the IHP as well. Okay. So, indicated horsepower, frictional horsepower and brake horsepower, these 3 measurements are also extremely important. Okay. And then you have to, I told you in couple of lectures earlier that we are also interested in figuring out the balance sheet, how much fuel we are putting in, where it is going, how much it is being used for useful work generation, how much of it is going into cooling, how much of it is going into exhaust, and how much is we are not able to account for. So, here you see, obviously if you have measured the fuel flow rate, so you know how much energy you are putting in, right, and you know how much useful work is being done in the form of BHP, you know how much heat is going to in cooling water, and you know how much heat is going into the exhaust, and then the difference of it is friction and unaccounted losses, and frictional losses are actually measured by frictional horsepower. So, these are some of the basic overall, if you look at the overall estimate at a very high level, these are the parameters that we are interested in measuring. Okay. So, now we will look at each one of them, how do we actually measure them, and what is the kind of principle, working principle for these measurement. So, first let us look at the measurement of the speed. How do we measure the speed? So, the best method of measuring the speed is to count the number of revolutions of the shaft in a given time. So, if you can manually count, take a stopwatch, you can manually count the rotation of the shaft, you can do that, but unfortunately engines are pretty fast and manually counting is ruled out, you will not see anything, right. So, you have to figure out some mechanism by which you can count it. If you have that mechanism which does this actual measurement with decent accuracy, then you will be able to measure the speed. Many engines are fitted with such revolution counters, RPM counter we call it, and for example, you must have seen tachometer. Tachometer is nothing but a mechanical device, you attach it to the shaft and then it starts rotating, and then you can read the number on the mechanical counter. And for reading that mechanical counter, basically there are gears inside the tachometer, and those gears are connected with the numbers, and whatever speed the shaft is rotating, that is reflected in the tachometer. So, a mechanical tachometer can be used, or electrical tachometer can also be used for measuring the speed. Okay. Electrical tachometer has a 3-phase permanent magnet alternator. Okay. So, what it is going to do, when it is rotating, it is going to generate voltage signal. So, with which a voltmeter is attached, the output of the alternator is a linear function of the speed. So, basically you will just measure the output and then convert it back into speed, okay, and is directly indicated on the voltmeter dial. So instead of looking at voltage, you just write, so it's just a voltmeter basically, and instead of voltage you will read RPM. You just change the numbers that is printed on the dial. Okay, so that is electrical tachometer. So both mechanical and electrical type tachometers are affected by temperature variations and are not very accurate, because mechanical, you know, you have a shaft and there is a small dimple in the shaft, you attach it, there is always a possibility of some slip, right? If it slips, then you will be reading a faulty reading. Okay, so similar thing happens in the electrical tachometer also. So tachometer is something that you physically go and attach to the shaft, and there could always be slip, and therefore it could lead to inaccurate measurement. So for accurate and continuous measurement of speed, either you place a magnetic pickup or an optical pickup, okay, which is placed near a, so magnetic pickup is placed near a toothed valve gear. So basically there is a toothed gear that is attached here. Okay, so toothed gear will have teeths and there will be magnetic pickup. So whenever a teeth passes in front of it, it will generate a spike, and those spikes can be counted electronically. Okay, so that way you can find out how many pulses are being generated, and you know how many pulses, how many teeths you have, and you can easily figure out using appropriate electronic circuit what is the RPM of the shaft. The other thing that is very popular and very simple is that either on the shaft or on the flywheel, and that we also do it very I mean quite usually in our lab, is that on the flywheel we stick a reflective tape, white color. So either we paint or put a highly reflective tape, and then we put up a optical device very close to it. So now this is reflecting, this is throwing some light onto the wheel, and obviously wheel is either black or blue. So once the black portion is there, it will not pick up anything. Okay, and once the white portion comes in front of it, the light will be reflected, and that's picked up, and that is converted into a spike, and those spikes are counted. It's a very accurate method. Okay, there is no possibility of any slippage. As long as you have white surface, nice and clean, reflecting light, you will have good measurement. So optical and magnetic methods are quite accurate, and they are used very effectively for measurement of speed. When we visit our lab, I can show you this as well. The second measurement that is important after the speed is fuel consumption measurement. Okay, so now you see, when you want to measure the fuel, if you look at the fuel is liquid most of the time. When we are talking about SI and CI engine fuel, normally in the context of IC engine, we talk about liquid fuels only. Gaseous fuels we use, but we treat them as a special case. Every measurement is separate for them, because you have to measure the gas fluid. So right now we assume that the fuel is liquid. So we know that liquid fuel density changes with temperature. Suppose today the temperature is 20 degree at this point in time. At night it may be 5 degree. Do you think the density of the fuel is going to be the same? It is going to change, maybe by only couple of percent, but that couple of percent will introduce inaccuracy into your result. Second thing is that if you measure the calorific value, what is the unit of calorific value? Unit of calorific value is megajoules per kilogram of fuel, not per liter of the fuel. Okay, so question is, if you want to measure the fuel flow rate, what is the easiest way to measure the fuel flow rate? It's the volumetric fuel consumption. Just put a burette, take a stopwatch and see in 20 seconds how much fuel is consumed. You can read the readings and then calculate that, multiply the volume by density of the fuel, and then you can easily figure out what is the fuel flow rate. So this kind of a measurement is called volumetric fuel flow measurement, but this will be inaccurate because you are not measuring the temperature and you are just taking one density. If you take the density of the time of the day, whatever is the temperature, that density if you take, then the measurement inaccuracy will be less. But we don't do that. We just take one density, whether the temperature is 45, summertime measurement or winter time measurement, we use the same value, right? And that causes inaccuracy in measurement. So, the most correct way is that somehow if you can measure gravimetrically, that means if you can measure the mass directly rather than measuring the volume and converting to mass, if you measure the mass directly, it will give you a better and accurate measurement. Okay, these measurement accuracies may be couple of percent, 3%, 4%, not more than that. But even 3 or 4% is a whole lot of difference. Suppose you are traveling in a vehicle and you are saying that okay, my car is giving 15 kilometers per liter, right, and you have 5% measurement inaccuracy. So, your car may be actually giving 14, but the company is claiming 15. That is not acceptable. So, that means the measurement has to be more accurate, right. So, gravimetric type, the consumption of an engine is measured by determining the volume flow rate at a given time interval, and then you can multiply it by specific gravity of the fuel at that temperature, which should be measured accurately, or you can directly measure the mass. This is not really very good method which is described here, that you measure the volume and then multiply it by density. Good method is that you measure the mass directly, mass flow rate directly, and volume flow rate is very simple. You just measure the time required for consumption of a given volume of fuel. Now, as I said, there could be many measurement errors apart from just the temperature. There could be many other measurement errors. For example, due to engine heat, whereas tank and pipe etc. is very close to engine, and engine gets heated up. If you run the engine for 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, everything gets heated up. So, even the fuel line gets heated up, and when the fuel line gets heated up, there will be some bubble formation. Why there will be bubble formation? Because the fuel is made of different hydrocarbons. There could be some hydrocarbons which have low boiling point, and if they have low boiling point and that kind of temperature is available from the heat of the engine, it could form bubbles. So, there could be heat vapor bubbles that are formed in the fuel line, and when these bubbles grow, the fuel volume increases, right, because they have a high volume, and backflow of the fuel can also take place. And if you are doing the volumetric measurement, bubbles will not have much mass of the fuel, but they will count towards volume. So, that will lead to inaccuracy. So, some fuel flow meter measure this backflow also. So, if bubbles are formed before or inside the flow meter, then indicated flow could be actually much higher than what actually it is. Okay, so, you will get higher reading of consumption than the actual consumption, right, because more flow is being counted, it is shown by the indicator, then more flow is taking place. If there is any swirl in the fuel flow, turbine type flow meters may register higher volume flow rate. So, if there is any kind of swirl in the fuel flow, that could also give inaccurate reading. The density of fuel is dependent on temperature, which can vary over wide range, giving rise to large errors in measurement. So, temperature could be different because of the ambient temperature and also because of the temperature of the engine, right. So, some flow meters which use light beam may also get affected by the color of the fuel. So, even the color can affect the accuracy in some distinct type of flow meters. The needle valve, which is a float ball of carburetor, opens and closes periodically, okay, allowing fuel to surge into the surge ball. This may cause water hammer effect. Water hammer effect means suddenly the fuel is going suddenly then stopping, suddenly it is going then stopping. So, this can cause a problem in the flow meter such as turbine type flow meter, because this turbine type of flow meter will keep on rotating because of the inertia, okay, even when the fuel has stopped, and therefore it will lead to large errors in the measurements.